This stops right now. You cannot keep us out. Watch me.
Deputies rolled steel barricades across the Marina Road while Victoria Hastings screamed my name into the morning fog. Her HOA had been running their $5 million boat traffic over my deeded access road for years, and now every SUV, trailer, and yacht owner behind her was trapped by flashing blue lights. The road was mine. The marina was theirs. The only way in crossed 800 yards of my land. A deputy slapped a red closure notice onto the gate keypad, and the whole line went silent. That was the moment Victoria realized she had built her kingdom on a road she never controlled. Boat horns moaned across Lake Mercer like wounded animals. Diesel exhaust hung low over the pavement. Trailer brakes hissed. Somewhere behind the barricade, a man in deck shoes shouted about missing his charter reservation, and a kid started crying in the back seat of a black Tahoe. Victoria stood in the middle of it all in a cream blazer, pearl earrings, and sunglasses too expensive for the gray light. She kept pointing at the deputies like volume could change county records. "This is Willow Harbor property," she snapped. "You can't shut down a community road." Deputy Cole didn't raise his voice. He just held the folded survey in one hand and kept his other hand resting on the barricade. I stood beside my truck, boots in the dust, watching her perform for an audience that had paid HOA dues for a marina they suddenly could not reach. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 41, white, and I spent most of my adult life buying distressed rural land, cleaning up bad titles, and turning forgotten acreage back into something useful. 6 months before that morning, I bought 8,400 acres outside Willow Harbor. No clubhouse. No covenants. No HOA. Just pine ridges, old cattle fence, 2 dry creek beds, and a narrow paved road cutting across the southwest corner like a scar nobody wanted to explain. At first, I thought the road served a county utility shed. Then the traffic started. White SUVs. Boat trailers. Catering vans. Golf carts with Willow Harbor decals. Every Friday afternoon, the pavement rattled under tires until the birds lifted out of the grass in nervous bursts. The marina. Lights glowed past my tree line at night. Music drifted over the water. So did the smell of grilled shrimp and gasoline. I asked one simple question at the guardhouse. Who gave them permission to cross my land? The guard looked at my dusty truck, my jeans, and my work boots. Then he smirked. "Road's been here longer than you have." Victoria arrived 5 minutes later in a white Range Rover with a gold HOA badge clipped to her lapel. She did not ask my name. She did not ask for paperwork. She told me I was blocking resident access and creating a safety issue. Then she had the guard photograph my license plate. That little camera flash stuck with me. 2 days later, a certified letter landed in my mailbox, accusing me of harassment, trespassing, and interference with private marina operations. The paper smelled like fresh toner. The signature at the bottom was hers. By then, I had already noticed something worse. Their gate keypad, security cameras, drainage culvert, and visitor lane were all bolted into ground covered by my legal description. This was not a neighborly misunderstanding. This was infrastructure. Somebody had spent millions assuming nobody would read the deed. Then Victoria made it public. She held an emergency HOA meeting at the marina entrance, and called me a land speculator trying to extort hardworking families. People clapped. Someone booed when I stepped out of my truck. I said nothing. The lake behind them glittered under the floodlights, calm and black, while the road under their feet carried the answer. Then the county survey crew painted 3 orange marks across the asphalt. The first orange paint mark appeared 3 days after Victoria's meeting. I found it at sunrise. Dew still covered the grass along the shoulder. The fresh paint cut straight across the asphalt like a warning line. A second mark sat 20 feet farther down. Then a third. County survey crews do not waste paint. They only mark what matters. The morning air smelled like wet pine and lake water. A heron lifted out of the reeds as I parked beside the road. Traffic had already started. Pickup trucks towing fishing boats rolled toward the marina. Golf carts buzzed past like oversized insects. Nobody paid attention to the paint. Nobody except me. One driver slowed long enough to lower his window. "You finally giving up?" he asked. Then he laughed and drove on. The orange mark stayed on my mind all week. Every evening I walked that stretch of pavement. I measured distances. I photographed drainage ditches. I checked fence lines buried beneath blackberry vines. Something about the road did not fit the surrounding land. The pavement looked newer than the culverts. The guard shack looked newer than the gate system. Even the marina signs seemed to have been added long after the original construction. Small details. But details matter. Especially when nobody else is looking. By Friday the traffic doubled. It was the start of a holiday weekend. Boat trailers stretched nearly a quarter mile before sunset. The smell of gasoline drifted through the trees. Music carried across the water. Floodlights flickered on near the docks. Willow Harbor looked less like a neighborhood and more like a resort. Victoria loved that image. She made sure everyone saw it. Her picture appeared on banners near the marina entrance. Her real estate company sponsored half the events. Every improvement somehow traced back to her name. Then another letter arrived. This one accused me of interfering with community development opportunities. I sat at my kitchen table reading it while rain tapped against the windows. The wording sounded polished. Expensive. The kind of language designed to intimidate before a courtroom ever became involved. I folded the paper and set it aside. Something else had my attention. Attached to the letter was an aerial image of the marina property. Victoria probably included it to show how successful the development had become. Instead, it highlighted something she should never have sent me. The access road was clearly visible from above. So was the tree line beside it. I compared the image to an old satellite map from county archives. Then I compared another. And another. The differences were subtle at first. A drainage ditch had moved. A retaining wall had appeared. A security lane had been widened. Every change pushed a little farther toward my side of the property. I spread maps across the table until midnight. Coffee went cold beside me. The kitchen smelled like paper and printer ink. Outside, rainwater drummed against the metal roof. Around 1 a.m. I noticed a small rectangular shape hidden near the southwest boundary. An old structure. Barely visible beneath tree cover. I stared at it for several seconds before realizing what it was. An abandoned ranch barn. I had passed it dozens of times without paying attention. The next morning I grabbed my keys and headed for the ridge. The barn was waiting. The barn sat on a low ridge overlooking the lake. Cedar branches scraped against my truck as I followed an overgrown ranch trail that had not seen regular traffic in years. The building looked older than anything else on the property. Sun-bleached boards. Rusted hinges. A sagging roof patched with mismatched sheets of metal. The place smelled like dust, dry wood, and old hay. I killed the engine and listened. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance a boat engine echoed across the water. The marina sounded busy even from up there. That detail stayed with me. The busiest place on the lake depended on land most people never thought about. I pushed open the barn door. The hinges groaned loud enough to startle a flock of birds from the rafters. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. Broken ranch equipment sat against one wall. Old fencing wire hung from nails. Nothing looked valuable. But people rarely hide important things in obvious places. I spent the next hour opening cabinets and sorting through forgotten boxes. Most contained exactly what I expected. Rusted tools. Feed receipts. Tractor manuals. Then I found a metal filing cabinet shoved behind a stack of lumber. Unlike everything else in the barn, it was locked. That immediately got my attention. Somebody had protected those contents long after everything else had been abandoned. I hauled the cabinet into better light and checked the back. The manufacturer label was still visible beneath a layer of dirt. The cabinet was decades old. Older than Willow Harbor itself. I sat on an overturned bucket and stared at it for several seconds. Then I noticed something scratched into the paint near the bottom drawer. Walker Ranch Records. My last name. My grandfather had owned ranch property in this county years before I started buying land professionally. I had never heard anyone mention this cabinet. The lock gave way after a few minutes of careful work. When the drawer finally opened, the smell of old paper rolled out into the room. Not mildew. Not decay. Just dry paper preserved by time. Inside were neatly organized folders. Survey reports. Utility correspondence. County planning notices. Everything dated and labeled. Whoever maintained these files believed documentation mattered. That was my kind of person. I started reading. 1 folder became 3. 3 became 10. The morning disappeared. Outside, sunlight shifted across the floorboards. The deeper I went, the more a pattern emerged. Roads. Easements. Utility corridors. Property adjustments. Every change had been documented with obsessive precision. Then I found a thick folder labeled Southwest Access Corridor. The words immediately sounded familiar. I had seen similar language on planning maps before. My pulse picked up slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just the feeling that comes when scattered pieces begin fitting together. I carried the folder outside and sat on the tailgate of my truck. The lake shimmered below the ridge. Boat traffic moved steadily toward the marina. The access road cut through the trees like a gray ribbon. I opened the folder. The first page contained a survey map. The second contained engineering notes. The third contained signatures. Lots of signatures. County officials. Surveyors. Property owners. Then I reached a page with a red stamp across the bottom. The date stopped me cold. It was nearly 50 years old. And every document after that seemed connected to the same stretch of pavement. I turned to the next page and saw Victoria's Marina from a completely different angle. I spread the documents across my tailgate and looked back and forth between the papers and the lake below. The marina appeared on the survey map, but not in the way I expected. The drawing showed the shoreline decades before Willow. Harbor existed. No docks. No clubhouse. No security gate. Just ranch land, timber, and a narrow access corridor crossing the southwest corner of the property. The same corridor carrying hundreds of vehicles every week. I followed the survey lines with my finger. Every measurement was precise. Every marker had coordinates. Nothing looked improvised. Then I noticed a handwritten note in the margin. It referenced a restricted access designation. That phrase appeared again 3 pages later. Then again in a county engineering memo. By itself, the wording meant very little. Together, it formed a pattern. Somebody had carefully defined how that corridor could be used. The afternoon sun baked the metal tailgate beneath my arms. Pine sap warmed in the heat. A pontoon boat drifted across the water below, its engine humming softly through the trees. The contrast felt strange. Everything looked peaceful. Yet the documents in front of me suggested something much larger had been overlooked. I spent the rest of the day scanning records and photographing pages. Back at the house, I converted the barn into a temporary workspace. Maps covered the dining table. Survey copies lined the walls. My laptop stayed open long after midnight. The deeper I dug, the more questions appeared. Then another detail surfaced. Willow Harbor's earliest planning documents never described the marina access as community-owned. They described it as existing access. Existing. That single word bothered me. Developers usually celebrate assets they control. They advertise them. They label them clearly. Existing access sounded different. Like something borrowed. Or something assumed. The next morning I drove into town and visited the county archives building. The place smelled like old paper and floor polish. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A clerk brought out several storage boxes after I gave her the parcel references from the barn files. Most of the records were routine. Utility permits. Drainage reviews. Environmental assessments. Then I found the development application that launched Willow Harbor decades earlier. I sat at a long wooden table and turned the pages one at a time. Every major feature had supporting documentation. The clubhouse, the marina basin, the parking areas, the shoreline improvements. But one section was remarkably thin: the access corridor. Instead of detailed ownership records, there were only references to previously established routes. The wording felt carefully chosen. Too carefully. My eyes kept returning to the same paragraph. It mentioned future coordination with adjacent landowners if conditions changed. Future coordination. Not ownership. Not transfer. Not dedication. Coordination. Outside, rain began tapping against the archive windows. The sound filled the room. I read the paragraph again. Then a third time. A retired surveyor sitting nearby noticed my stack of maps. He glanced at one page and nodded slowly. "That road caused debates years ago," he said. "People thought somebody would eventually straighten out the paperwork." He returned to his newspaper before I could ask another question. That comment stayed with me all afternoon. Somebody would eventually straighten out the paperwork. Apparently nobody ever had. By sunset I returned to the property carrying copies of everything I had found. The road below remained packed with Marina traffic. Headlights moved through the trees in a steady stream. They all trusted the same route. They all depended on the same pavement. And for the first time, I started wondering what would happen if someone finally checked every boundary line. The following week, I stopped arguing and started documenting. Every morning before sunrise, I'd park near the tree line and counted vehicles entering the marina corridor. Pickup trucks. Luxury SUVs. Boat trailers worth more than some houses. The numbers added up fast. By noon on Saturdays, hundreds of people had crossed that strip of pavement. The road had become the artery feeding the entire waterfront development. That fact mattered more with every document I uncovered. The air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and lake water. Gulls circled above the docks. Music drifted from the marina patio. On the surface, Willow Harbor looked prosperous. Underneath, the foundation felt increasingly fragile. Victoria, meanwhile, acted like the dispute had already been settled. Her picture appeared in another community newsletter. She announced marina expansion plans. Additional slips. More parking. New landscaping. She spoke about the future with absolute confidence. One paragraph caught my attention. The project would increase visitor capacity by nearly 40%. I read that line twice. Then I looked at the traffic counts sitting on my desk. They were preparing to increase dependence on the very corridor nobody seemed willing to examine closely. A few days later, I attended a public planning meeting at the county administration building. I sat quietly near the back. Victoria stood near the front in a navy blazer, smiling and shaking hands. The room smelled like coffee and copier toner. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as residents settled in. Presentation slides flashed across a projector screen. New marina amenities. Enhanced visitor access. Improved waterfront experiences. The audience loved it. Several people applauded. Then one county planner asked a routine question about infrastructure coordination. Victoria answered smoothly. Too smoothly. She described the access route as established and reliable. The wording immediately sounded familiar. I had seen those exact terms in older records. Established. Reliable. Useful words. But none of them meant ownership. None of them solved the question that had been following me for weeks. When the meeting ended, I walked outside into warm evening air. The courthouse clock struck 6. Cars pulled out of the parking lot. Victoria emerged a few minutes later surrounded by board members. She noticed me standing near my truck. Her smile vanished for half a second. Then it returned. Polished. Controlled. Professional. "Still chasing paperwork?" she asked. I shrugged. "Still building on assumptions?" The silence between us lasted longer than either question. Then she climbed into her Range Rover and drove away. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. Yet it confirmed something important. She was paying attention. Back at home, I reviewed every file again. One detail kept surfacing. References to adjacent landowner coordination appeared repeatedly. Throughout decades of planning documents, the phrase showed up too often to be accidental. Around midnight, while comparing survey overlays on my computer, another inconsistency appeared. The dimensions used in newer development maps did not perfectly match the dimensions recorded in the older survey package from the barn. The difference was small, barely noticeable. Most people would never see it. But once I spotted it, I could not ignore it. I zoomed in closer. Then closer again. A narrow section near the southwest corridor shifted by just enough to raise serious questions. My coffee had gone cold. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The glow from my monitor illuminated stacks of records covering the room. For the first time, I realized this might extend beyond a single road. The next survey comparison made that possibility impossible to ignore. The next survey comparison sat on my screen for nearly an hour before I fully understood what I was seeing. 2 maps. 2 different decades. 2 versions of the same corridor. At first glance, they looked identical. The kind of difference most people would scroll past without a second thought. But surveyors do not measure land with guesses. Inches matter. Angles matter. Boundaries matter. I overlaid the older survey from the barn onto the newer development map and adjusted the scale. The lines refused to match. Not by much. Just enough. The southwest corridor had shifted. The movement was subtle. Maybe 15 feet in one section. 20 in another. Small numbers on paper. Huge numbers when concrete, utilities, gates, and traffic lanes are involved. Outside, wind pushed rain against the windows. The room smelled like coffee and printer ink. My dining table had disappeared beneath stacks of records. Every surface held maps. Every chair held folders. I printed the overlays and spread them across the floor. Then I walked through them one page at a time. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The newer plans consistently favored the Marina side. Not dramatically. Just enough to make inconvenient boundaries disappear. I wanted another opinion. The following morning I drove to a surveying firm in the next county. The owner, Robert Jenkins, had spent more than 30 years reviewing property disputes throughout the region. His office smelled like cedar and blueprint paper. Framed plats covered the walls. He listened quietly while flipping through copies of my records. Occasionally he circled something with a pencil. Occasionally he nodded. He did not say much. That actually reassured me. Experienced people rarely rush toward conclusions. 20 minutes later he placed 2 surveys side by side. Then he leaned back in his chair. "These lines deserve a closer look," he said. That was all. No dramatic statement. No certainty. But it was enough. By the end of the week, Robert's team conducted a field review. Bright orange flags appeared near the corridor. Survey equipment stood along the shoulder. Marina traffic continued flowing as if nothing had changed. Golf carts rolled past. Boat trailers rattled over the pavement. Vacationers carried coolers toward the docks. Most never noticed the crews working nearby. Victoria noticed. On the second day, her Range Rover appeared before noon. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and carrying a clipboard. Even from a distance I could tell she was unhappy. She spent nearly 20 minutes talking with the survey team. Then she pointed toward my property. Nobody stopped working. Nobody removed a single marker. That seemed to frustrate her even more. Later that afternoon another letter arrived. This one demanded that all unauthorized interference with community infrastructure cease immediately. I read it while standing beside my mailbox. Cicadas buzzed from the trees. Heat shimmered above the asphalt. The wording had become more aggressive. The confidence behind it felt thinner. That contrast caught my attention. People rarely escalate when they feel secure. They escalate when questions get too close to answers. 3 days later Robert called. His voice sounded calm. almost too calm. He asked if I could meet him at the property before sunrise. No explanation. No details. Just the time and location. The next morning, fog drifted over the lake as I pulled up beside the corridor. Survey flags lined both sides of the pavement. Robert stood beside a tripod-mounted instrument staring toward the marina entrance. Then he handed me a fresh set of coordinates. Robert handed me the coordinate sheet, while fog drifted across the corridor in slow gray waves. The paper felt cold in my hands. I looked from the numbers to the pavement, and back again. Then I followed the highlighted points across the survey map. The result was impossible to ignore. The access corridor did not simply touch my property. It sat squarely inside it. The gate system. The visitor lane. The security cameras. Even portions of the landscaping improvements. Everything aligned with the original boundary records preserved inside the barn. A fishing boat rolled past behind us. Trailer tires rattled over the asphalt. The driver never looked our way. He had no reason to. To him, this road had always belonged to the marina. That assumption suddenly seemed very expensive. Robert remained careful with his words. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He simply pointed to the survey monuments his team had verified and the legal descriptions supporting them. Then he folded the map and nodded once. "You should speak with a property attorney." By noon I was sitting in a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Sunlight reflected off parked cars below. The office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Attorney Sarah Mitchell reviewed every file I brought. She moved methodically through the stack. Survey reports. Archive records. Planning applications. Historic plats. The room stayed quiet except for the occasional turn of a page. Nearly an hour passed before she finally leaned back. "This is not a simple boundary disagreement," she said. Those words carried more weight than anything Victoria had said for months. Sarah explained that before anyone made accusations, every document needed to be verified independently. Every survey needed review. Every historical reference needed confirmation. I appreciated that approach. Facts first. Reactions later. Over the next several weeks, that process unfolded exactly as she described. Additional records arrived from county storage. Historic aerial photographs surfaced. Engineering notes matched references from the barn. Every new piece fit the same picture. Meanwhile, Willow Harbor continued expanding. New decorative lighting appeared near the marina entrance. Landscaping crews installed fresh shrubs along the corridor. Contractors measured locations for additional visitor parking. Victoria proudly posted progress photos across community newsletters and social media updates. Each improvement increased dependence on infrastructure sitting in the middle of an unresolved ownership question. That detail never left my mind. One evening I parked on a ridge overlooking the lake. The setting sun turned the water orange. Boats returned to the docks. Music drifted from the Marina restaurant. The place looked successful. Stable. Permanent. Yet I knew something most residents did not. Their confidence rested on an assumption repeated for decades without verification. Assumptions can survive a surprisingly long time. Until paperwork catches up. A month later Sarah called and asked me to come to her office immediately. Her voice remained calm. But there was something different underneath it. When I arrived, several folders sat neatly arranged across her conference table. Every document carried fresh certification stamps. Every survey had been reviewed. Every question we started with finally had an answer. Then she slid one final report across the table. Sarah slid the final report across the table and tapped a highlighted section near the center of the page. Morning sunlight reflected off the conference room window behind her. The courthouse lawn below looked peaceful. Inside that report, nothing was peaceful anymore. Every survey had been verified. Every historical record had been cross-checked. Every boundary marker matched the original legal descriptions preserved inside the barn. The conclusion was simple. The corridor serving the marina remained inside my property boundaries. Not partially. Not ambiguously. Entirely. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Traffic drifted through the streets below. Sarah finally folded her hands. "Now we move carefully," she said. That became the strategy. No grand announcement. No social media battle. No emotional confrontation. Just documentation. Certified notices were prepared. Survey packages were organized. Historical records were indexed. Everything moved through proper channels. The process took weeks. During that time, Willow Harbor continued operating exactly as before. Boat trailers rolled through the corridor. Residents attended waterfront events. New landscaping appeared near the entrance. Victoria acted as if expansion plans were inevitable. The more she invested, the more difficult it became to understand why nobody had examined the ownership question earlier. One afternoon I drove past the Marina and noticed construction crews installing decorative stone features near the visitor lane. Fresh concrete filled the air with its sharp mineral smell. Workers moved equipment back and forth across the corridor. Nobody looked concerned. Nobody suspected anything was changing. Yet several official reviews were already underway. The contrast felt surreal. A system can appear perfectly stable right before reality reaches it. Then the responses started arriving. Engineers reviewed the corridor records. County officials reviewed the certified surveys. Additional documentation was requested. Then more documentation. Every request was answered. Every question led back to the same conclusion. By late summer, the review process had expanded far beyond a disagreement between a property owner and an HOA board. Infrastructure access had become the central issue. One evening Sarah called while I was standing near the ridge above the lake. The sunset painted the water gold. Boat wakes shimmered across the surface. Her voice sounded steady. "The county has completed its assessment." I listened carefully. "And?" A brief pause followed. "They agree with the surveys." The wind moved through the pines around me. For a moment I simply watched the Marina lights beginning to appear below. Months of records. Months of research. Months of quiet preparation. Everything had led to that sentence. Yet the real consequences had not arrived. Not yet. A few days later official meetings began taking place behind closed doors. Lawyers attended. Surveyors attended. County representatives attended. Victoria attended. I was not in the room, but word traveled quickly through local channels. The discussions were tense. Proposals were exchanged. Deadlines were discussed. The Marina continued operating during every stage of the process. Residents still launched boats. Visitors still crossed the corridor. Most had no idea how close everything had come to changing. Then a certified county notice was issued. The date printed on that document immediately caught my attention. It fell on the busiest boating weekend of the season. Saturday arrived faster than anyone expected. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a line of boat trailers stretching farther than I had ever seen. The lake reflected the first light of day. Marina staff hurried between docks carrying clipboards and coffee cups. Families unloaded coolers. Engines idled. Everything looked normal for about 10 minutes. Then the first sheriff vehicles appeared. Blue lights flashed against the water. Deputies moved with calm efficiency. Steel barricades rolled into place across the corridor. Radios crackled. Conversation stopped. One by one, drivers stepped out of their vehicles trying to understand what was happening. The smell of gasoline and lake water hung in the air. Boat horns echoed from the docks. Nobody seemed prepared for what came next. I parked near the edge of the property and watched. Victoria arrived less than 15 minutes later. Her white Range Rover stopped hard near the entrance. She stepped out carrying a folder and immediately headed toward the deputies. Even from a distance I could hear the sharp edge in her voice. She pointed toward the marina. She pointed toward the traffic. She pointed toward the barricades. The deputies listened politely. Then one of them unfolded a certified survey package and handed her a copy. The expression on her face changed almost instantly. Around us, confusion spread through the crowd. Residents called board members. Board members called attorneys. Visitors checked reservation confirmations that suddenly meant nothing. The entire marina remained physically intact. The docks were still there. The boats were still there. The restaurants were still there. But access had become the problem nobody could ignore. Hours passed. The line of vehicles grew longer. News crews arrived before noon. Camera operators filmed the barricades. Reporters interviewed frustrated visitors. Throughout it all, the deputies remained calm. They were not there to argue. They were there to enforce the outcome of a completed review process. The same process Victoria had dismissed months earlier. By mid-afternoon, the story had spread across the county. Property owners began asking questions. Residents demanded answers. People wanted to know how a development of that size could depend on infrastructure it never properly controlled. That question echoed through every interview and every meeting that followed. Over the next several months, negotiations continued. Easement proposals were discussed. Access alternatives were evaluated. Engineers reviewed options. Attorneys reviewed documents. None of those conversations changed the central fact. The corridor belonged exactly where the record said it belonged. Eventually an agreement was reached. The terms remained private. The outcome did not. Willow Harbor paid dearly to secure the access it had assumed was already guaranteed. Expansion plans slowed. Board elections followed. Victoria quietly disappeared from leadership shortly afterward. The banners with her picture eventually came down. The newsletters stopped mentioning her name. One evening nearly a year later, I stood on the same ridge above the lake where this entire story had truly begun. The marina lights reflected across the water. Boats moved slowly toward the docks. The corridor below remained busy. The difference was simple. Everyone finally understood who controlled it. The wind moved through the pines. The lake remained calm. And the most valuable thing at Willow Harbor was never the marina. It was the road everyone forgot to check.